Picture this. It's a misty morning in the year 1450. You're standing knee-deep in the forests surrounding what we now call the Great Lakes, where morning mist rises from 10,000 waters like the breath of sleeping giants. The air is thick with moisture, the ground soft with spring runoff, and everywhere you look, water finds its way into wood, into stone, into the very bones of any structure foolish enough to challenge it directly. But here's what would amaze you. Scattered throughout these seemingly impossible conditions, you'd find structures that have been standing strong for generations. Not just standing, thriving. Buildings that breathe with the forest, that dance with the seasons instead of fighting them. These aren't the rough shelters you might imagine. These are sophisticated pieces of engineering that would make modern architects weep with envy. The Anishinaabe people, Anishinaabe, and when I say people, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of individuals across dozens of communities, each with their own innovations and improvements on ancient wisdom. These people had discovered something profound about building in harmony with moisture. For more than 1,500 years before Europeans arrived, indigenous communities from what we now call Minnesota to Ontario had perfected the art of the elevated platform. Now, when I say perfected, I don't mean they just figured out how to stick some logs under a house and call it good. We're talking about centuries, literally centuries, of accumulated wisdom about drainage angles precise to the degree, air circulation patterns that would make modern HVAC engineers jealous, and what one master builder called the sacred mathematics of keeping wood dry. Master builder Joseph Kingbird of the Red Lake, Ojibwe. And here's a man whose knowledge was so respected that people would travel for weeks just to learn from him, would teach his apprentices that every structure must breathe like a paper, living thing. Think about that for a moment. In our modern world, we seal buildings tight as drums, then wonder why we have moisture problems. But Kingbird understood something we're only rediscovering. Buildings need to breathe. The platforms weren't just raised floors. They represented centuries of accumulated wisdom that makes our modern building codes look like crude first attempts. These master builders knew exactly how much space to leave between ground and floor for optimal airflow. They knew which woods worked best in which positions. They understood drainage in ways that would make modern civil engineers take notes. Each spring, when ice melted and groundwater rose like some ancient seasonal tide, Menominee families would gather for the platform blessing ceremony. Now, you might think this was just some quaint ritual, but listen to what they were actually doing. They were thanking their structures for surviving another winter. These buildings weren't just shelter. They were partners in survival, tested annually by the harshest conditions nature could throw at them. And here's something that'll blow your mind. Children learned to identify the 17 different types of wood rot by smell alone. 17 different types. Can you imagine sending a modern construction worker to sniff out moisture damage? But these kids could walk up to a structure and tell you not just if there was rot, but what kind, how advanced it was, and what needed to be done about it. The women of these communities wove special moisture barriers from birch bark and pine pitch, creating waterproof membranes that modern science would later recognize as ingeniously effective. We're talking about materials that performed better than many modern synthetics, created from what the forest provided and refined through generations of experimentation. These elevated longhouses could shelter 40 people for decades without significant decay. 40 people! For decades, while their careful positioning caught morning sun but avoided afternoon humidity. This wasn't primitive construction, AST. This was engineering excellence born from intimate observation of water's behavior across seasons, across years, across lifetimes of careful study. Think about the sophistication required here. Every beam placement, every angle, every gap between boards was calculated not through abstract mathematics, but through generations of lived experience with moisture, with wood, with the relentless creativity of water finding its way into places it shouldn't be. These builders understood that fighting water was futile. The secret was to make water your ally, to design with it instead of against it. But here's where our story takes a turn that'll make your blood boil, because what happened next represents one of the greatest acts of architectural arrogance in human history. When European colonizers arrived, they looked at these magnificent structures, INZ buildings that had weathered centuries of the harshest conditions on Earth and dismissed them as primitive. What they were about to do would set back moisture-resistant construction by centuries, would cost billions in damage that could have been prevented, and would nearly erase knowledge that had taken 1,500 years to perfect. The collision between indigenous engineering genius and European architectural arrogance was about to begin, and the consequences would echo through the centuries right up to your basement flooding last spring. In 1621, Jean Nicolet stepped off his canoe onto Menominee land carrying more than just European trade goods. He carried with him the absolute certainty that European building methods were superior to anything these primitive people could possibly know about construction. What happened next would be repeated thousands of times across the continent, and it represents one of the most expensive cases of architectural arrogance in human history. Picture Nicolet, a man who'd survived the Atlantic crossing, who'd navigated the treacherous waters of the Great Lakes, who was smart enough to establish successful trading relationships with indigenous communities. This wasn't some bumbling fool. He was, by the standards of his time, an experienced and capable builder. And yet, when Chief Standing Bear approached him with advice about raising his foundation, Nicolet dismissed it with the kind of polite condescension that would echo through centuries. "These people build in trees like animals," he wrote in a letter back to France. "Surely civilized men can improve upon such wasteful methods. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a saw." Here was a man whose own people were still figuring out basic sanitation, lecturing master builders who had solved moisture management 1,500 years before his ancestors had figured out soap. Nicolet built his trading post directly on the damp ground, using European techniques that had worked reasonably well in the drier climates of France. Within 3 years, the post's lower logs had rotted through completely. Not partially rotted, completely rotted. The entire structure had to be rebuilt. And here's the kicker. During those same 3 years, the indigenous structures nearby stood as solid as the day they were built. But did this experience humble Nicolet? Did he think, perhaps these people know something I don't? Not a chance. He blamed the climate. He blamed the wood. He blamed everything except his own stubborn refusal to learn from people who had been successfully building in this environment for generations. This pattern repeated across the continent like some kind of architectural plague. Fort Michilimackinac, constructed in 1715 by French military engineers, IDAC, men trained in the finest European techniques, required constant replacement of rotted timbers. The maintenance logs are absolutely staggering. They were replacing structural elements every few years, while nearby indigenous structures stood strong after generations. Colonial administrator William Johnson wrote in his 1758 journal about the curious native habit of wasting wood to build unnecessary platforms. Wasting wood. Here's a man watching buildings that lasted decades while his own structures rotted around him, and he's criticizing the indigenous builders for wasting wood. The cognitive dissonance is almost impressive in its completeness. What Johnson and countless others like him couldn't see, or refused to see, was that they were witnessing sophisticated environmental engineering. Every unnecessary platform was a carefully calculated response to moisture conditions. Every wasteful gap between boards was precisely designed for optimal airflow. The indigenous builders weren't wasting anything. They were investing in longevity. But the real tragedy wasn't just the rotting European structures. That was expensive and embarrassing, but it was ultimately their own problem. The real tragedy was what came next. The systematic suppression of indigenous building knowledge that began in earnest in the 1870s, when government boarding schools began forbidding indigenous construction methods. They weren't just suppressing culture, they were erasing practical knowledge that could have saved countless structures and billions of dollars in damage. Master builder Mary Skywater of the Potawatomi was prohibited from teaching platform construction to students at Carlisle Industrial School. Think about that. A woman whose knowledge could have revolutionized American construction was silenced by administrators who couldn't tell the difference between cultural practice and engineering excellence. Federal housing programs then forced families into ground-level homes that developed black mold within months. The government was literally forcing people out of moisture-resistant structures and into buildings that made them sick. And when these structures failed, guess who got blamed? Not the designers, not the administrators, not the policies, the families living in the failing buildings. By 1920, traditional platform knowledge survived only in the memories of elders and in a few remote communities that had managed to resist government interference. 1,500 years of accumulated wisdom was reduced to fragments, whispered stories, and the occasional structure hidden deep enough in the woods to escape official notice. The cost wasn't just cultural, though the cultural loss was immeasurable. Government reports from 1934 documented that reservation housing required replacement 3 times more frequently than traditional structures would have. 3 times, but rather than questioning their building methods, officials blamed poor maintenance and cultural resistance to proper upkeep. The numbers are staggering when you really think about them. Millions of structures built, using European methods in North American climates, failing at rates that would have been prevented by indigenous techniques, billions of dollars in damage that could have been avoided. Countless families forced to live in moldy, unhealthy conditions because the people in charge were too arrogant to learn from the people they were displacing. But here's what makes this story remarkable. The knowledge didn't die. Against all odds, despite systematic suppression, despite cultural genocide, despite every attempt to erase it from memory, some of that ancient wisdom survived, hidden in the memories of elders, preserved in a few structures that escaped destruction, waiting for someone with the vision to recognize its value. That someone would be a woman with 1 foot in the indigenous world and 1 foot in the modern engineering establishment. Someone who could see past centuries of prejudice to recognize genius when she found it. And when she did, she would begin a revolution that would transform how we think about building in harmony with moisture forever. In 1987, Susan Cloud Walker made a discovery that would change everything. She was 34 years old, fresh from MIT with a degree in structural engineering and a head full of modern building techniques, when she found herself cleaning out her grandmother's attic after the funeral. Hidden in a dusty trunk beneath layers of old quilts, she discovered something extraordinary: detailed sketches of traditional Ojibwe platform construction. Now, Cloud Walker had spent 6 years at one of the world's most prestigious engineering schools. She'd studied under professors who were legends in their field. She'd learned structural mechanics, materials science, and environmental engineering from the finest minds of her generation. But sitting in that attic, looking at her grandmother's hand-drawn diagrams, she suddenly understood what those brilliant professors had missed. These weren't primitive shelters. These were sophisticated moisture management systems that incorporated principles her MIT professors were just beginning to understand. Every angle, every gap, every seemingly random detail had a purpose that modern engineering was only starting to appreciate. Her grandmother had preserved knowledge that academia was trying to rediscover from scratch. Cloud Walker's first challenge came at the Pine Ridge housing development, where 43 of 50 ground-level homes showed severe rot damage after just 15 years. 15 years. These weren't century-old structures slowly succumbing to age. These were relatively new buildings, failing at rates that would have been unthinkable to indigenous builders. When Cloud Walker proposed elevated platforms as a solution, the reaction was swift and predictable. Contractors called it building tree houses. The project manager, Thomas Henderson, threatened to pull funding if she insisted on what he termed going backwards to primitive construction methods. Here was a woman with MIT credentials being lectured about engineering by people whose buildings were literally rotting beneath their feet. But Cloud Walker had something her critics didn't. She understood the science behind what her ancestors had achieved. She could explain in modern engineering terms why air circulation beneath platforms prevented the moisture accumulation that was destroying existing structures. She could calculate load distributions, airflow patterns, and thermal dynamics in ways that made the ancient wisdom accessible to modern skeptics. The breakthrough came when she set up a side-by-side demonstration. 2 identical test structures, one built on a traditional ground-level foundation, the other on an elevated platform using indigenous principles, but calculated with modern engineering precision. The results were dramatic enough to convince even Henderson. Within 6 months, the ground-level structure showed significant moisture damage, while the elevated platform remained bone-dry. But the real turning point, the moment that would transform Cloudwalker from an interesting curiosity into a revolutionary force in architecture, came during the Great Midwest Floods of 1993. This was a disaster of biblical proportions. The Mississippi River reached levels not seen in centuries. Des Moines was underwater. Conventional buildings suffered catastrophic water damage that would take years and millions of dollars to repair. And then there was the Red Earth Community Center. Built on Cloudwalker's indigenous platform design, it sat like an island of sanity in a sea of destruction. While neighboring buildings were gutted by floodwater, while insurance adjusters were writing off entire city blocks as total losses, the Red Earth Center emerged completely unscathed. Insurance adjuster Margaret Chen documented how water flowed harmlessly beneath the elevated structure while neighboring buildings required million-dollar remediation. Chen wasn't some cultural enthusiast looking to promote indigenous knowledge. She was a hard-nosed insurance professional whose job was to minimize claims, and she was absolutely stunned by what she witnessed. "I've never seen anything like it," Chen wrote in her report. Buildings on either side were destroyed, but this structure might as well have been on another planet. The water just flowed underneath like it was designed to do exactly that. Which, of course, it was. Cloudwalker had essentially created a modern version of structures that had been weathering floods for over 1,000 years. News spread through architectural circles like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about this radical new approach to moisture management. Professor James Hartley of Cornell, ATC, one of the most respected names in structural engineering, invited Cloudwalker to present her methods to the International Conference on Sustainable Building Design. The irony was delicious. Hartley introduced her as a pioneer in innovative building techniques, completely unaware he was actually learning thousand-year-old wisdom. Cloudwalker stood at that podium, looking out at an audience of the world's leading architects and engineers, and taught them principles that her ancestors had perfected when their ancestors were still living in hovels. By 1995, 3 major architectural firms had hired indigenous consultants, though most still viewed platform construction as an interesting novelty rather than essential innovation. They were willing to experiment, but they hadn't yet grasped the full implications of what Cloudwalker was teaching them. That would change dramatically when nature provided another brutal demonstration of the superiority of indigenous building principles. A disaster so massive, so undeniable in its implications, that even the most stubborn traditionalists would be forced to admit that sometimes the old ways aren't just better. They're the only ways that actually work. Hurricane Katrina was about to make Cloudwalker's methods not just interesting, but absolutely essential for the future of American construction. And when the waters receded, the architectural world would never be the same. August 29, 2005. Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast with the fury of nature unleashed, and when the waters finally receded, they revealed something extraordinary. While conventional buildings had become toxic mold incubators, while entire neighborhoods were being condemned as uninhabitable, the handful of structures built using elevated platform principles emerged like monuments to ancient wisdom. The transformation that followed was swift and dramatic. Insurance companies, ETA. And remember, these are organizations that care about exactly one thing, minimizing financial risk, began studying Cloudwalker's data with the intensity of archaeologists examining priceless artifacts. What they discovered changed the entire economics of construction. Platform construction reduced moisture claims by 78%. 78%. Think about what that means in dollars and cents. We're talking about billions of dollars in damage prevented, millions of families who didn't lose their homes to mold, countless communities that didn't have to be abandoned to the patient destruction of moisture. Suddenly, financial incentives aligned with indigenous wisdom in a way they never had before. When insurance companies started offering premium discounts for elevated construction, when banks began requiring moisture-resistant design for loans in flood-prone areas, The revolution accelerated beyond anything Cloud Walker had imagined possible. The International Building Code editions of 2009 included elevation requirements directly inspired by native platform principles. Read that again. The modern building codes that govern construction across America now include requirements based on indigenous knowledge that was nearly lost to cultural suppression. Major developments from Seattle to Miami began incorporating what marketing departments euphemistically called innovative raised foundation systems. The irony was rich. Here were the same architectural firms that had dismissed indigenous construction as primitive, now marketing thousand-year-old techniques as cutting-edge innovation. But Cloud Walker didn't care about the irony. She cared about results, and the results were extraordinary. The Nike headquarters in Oregon, designed with indigenous platform principles, weathered unprecedented rainfall without a single moisture-related issue. The Chicago Children's Museum, elevated using traditional techniques adapted with modern materials, became a model for institutional construction in moisture-prone areas. Even more remarkably, Dubai's Sustainable City Project, AS Niement, a development on the other side of the City, a world in completely different climate conditions, AS began incorporating platform principles when designers realized that elevation solved moisture problems regardless of whether that moisture came from floods, humidity, or groundwater infiltration. Today, the Sustainable Indigenous Design Institute, founded by Cloud Walker's former apprentices, trains architects worldwide in principles that were old when Europe was young. What colonizers dismissed as wasteful now saves billions in moisture damage annually. What government officials suppressed as primitive now represents the cutting edge of climate-resilient construction. Young Menominee builder Daniel Crowfeather exemplifies this remarkable renaissance. He uses laser levels to achieve the same drainage angles his ancestors perfected with string and stone. He calculates load distributions with computer modeling software, but he designs those distributions based on principles passed down through generations of master builders. Every platform we build is both an engineering project and an act of cultural healing, Crowfeather explains. We're not just preventing moisture damage. We're proving that our ancestors were right all along. We're reclaiming knowledge that never should have been suppressed in the first place. Cloud Walker, now 71, teaches that every elevated platform built represents both practical engineering and cultural healing. When she stands before audiences of international architects, when she sees indigenous principles being implemented in projects from Alaska to Australia, she thinks about her grandmother's sketches hidden in that dusty trunk. The story comes full circle, as indigenous knowledge, nearly lost to prejudice and suppression, becomes essential to building humanity's climate-resilient future. In an age when extreme weather events are becoming the norm rather than the exception, when conventional construction fails repeatedly in the face of nature's fury, the ancient wisdom of building in harmony rather than opposition offers our best hope for survival. In 2024, when the American Institute of Architects awarded Cloud Walker its gold medal, AT, the highest honor in American architecture, he accepted on behalf of all the unnamed indigenous builders whose wisdom survived centuries of dismissal to save our structures from rot's patient destruction. "This medal doesn't belong to me," she said in her acceptance speech. "It belongs to every master builder who preserved this knowledge when the world told them it was worthless. It belongs to every grandmother who kept the old stories alive. It belongs to every community that refused to let ancient wisdom die." As we face an uncertain climate future, as we confront the reality that our traditional building methods are increasingly inadequate for the challenges ahead, the story of indigenous platform construction offers both practical solutions and profound hope. Sometimes, the way forward requires looking back. Sometimes the most advanced technology is the wisdom of those who came before. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get a second chance to learn from teachers we should have listened to all along. The platforms rise again, not as monuments to the past, but as foundations for a future where human ingenuity works with nature instead of against it, where ancient wisdom and modern innovation combine to create something stronger than either could achieve alone. The sacred geometry of survival, it turns out, was never really lost. It was just waiting for us to be wise enough to rediscover it.